What's up, guys? Static in the Attic. I thought we'd get out from behind the computer screen, go for a little motorcycle ride, and do a historical reality check for a lot of people. I think a lot of people that can't figure out how cities are built need to get out to the countryside and check out all of the historical sites around this country. Because when you go out and study history in the real world, examples like this are all over the place. This is just absolutely frozen in time of when settlers came over and brought the knowledge and engineering skills that they had back in their home countries, in the case that we're looking at here, German engineering, and carved out a new life for themselves in what was once Cherokee land. This is the Ozarks. And just like the Civil War battlefields, you can't erase the real history from the children and the grandchildren of the people that came over that still live in this area. Now, this would have been hitting the settlers' jackpot because the people that made it this far into the hills of southern Missouri are the people that had a little bit of capital, a little bit of money in their pockets, and a little bit of knowledge and education about real world applications like building mills. It would appear that the vast majority of immigrants that came over either were indentured servants or owned right outright, or they came into places like New York City, got conscripted straight into the army. And I've seen a lot of roles that it appears that as soon as they got off the boat, they were asked if they had an occupation. And you better say that you've got an occupation or they'll find one for you. This was way before any welfare systems or anything like that. So you had to prove that you were going to be a productive member of society or at least be able to take care of yourself. Otherwise, depending on what time frame you showed up, you either got a gun or an axe put in your hand. If it was during the 60s, then you were conscripted straight into the Northern Army, or you had the glamorous job of cutting railroad or cutting railroad ties. It's been a joke for generations that kids these days don't know what work is. Well, from reading the comments, it's actually true now. Kids these days, and even grown ass adults, have obviously, by reading their comments, never done a hard day's work in their life. They don't know what a person can actually accomplish in a day. Apparently, some people can't understand how they built the cities, but guys, this is out in the middle of nowhere still to this day. I mean, roads just came to this area like in the 1990s. And out here, hundreds of miles from the rest of civilization, they were able to build themselves a big, huge stone schoolhouse. This was all built with hand tools out in the middle of nowhere, and it's extremely good craftsmanship. These are all actually faced rocks. It's perfectly smooth. Look down the side of it. You see how flat that wall is? Now, I'm assuming somewhere along the current river, somebody had a kiln set up for making concrete because there's a lot of concrete all over the place out here that they probably hauled in by boat, but I'm guessing they had the kiln somewhere close to fry up the clinker, and then the clinker gets crushed into concrete. But the only things they would have had to have imported here were the glass panes and the cement. The roof would have been cedar shake back in the day. But these people didn't grow up with 12 years of useless information drilled into their head. They grew up learning useful skills that you can apply in the real world. Now, let me show you guys just how remote this actually is. This is located in Shannon County, Missouri, on the current river. The rivers were the highways back in the day. That's how you got around. So you have the current river here, meandering up through the hills in Arkansas. You had train lines to the east, and you have train lines that eventually came to the west through the hills. To the east, you're still over in flatlands. And other than the riverways, you've got hundreds of miles of Ozark hills and forest that were basically a no man's land. You can't go more than a few days away from a water source. This will give you an idea of the scale of things. It's about 100 miles across of solid forest. You zoom in a little bit closer and you see it's just hills and hollers for 100 miles. If you get a mile off of the river in some areas, then you've really gone somewhere because it is thick. It's full of ticks and chiggers. This time of year, you don't really go there. These hills are still great for deer and turkey hunting, but it's so rocky. Some people have cut out farms here, but it's a lot of work to do anything here. One thing we do have is trees. The biggest problem I have with this capitalist system that we have going, and no, this isn't a Marxist plug, but it's the fact that all of the natural resources always wind up in the hands of the few and the well-connected. But that is a whole other discussion. So by the 1900s, there were said to have been about 3,000 settlers in all of Shannon County. And then they had a big lumber boom. Basically, every town in America is either a boom or bust town. So there was a big lumber boom here, and they said about 15,000 people total lived in the county during the time of the huge lumber boom. So some of these are commercial mills like Alley Springs here. This is Alley Spring that actually feeds the water for the mill itself, but it's right about 200 yards from the current river. So cut your boards, you float them downstream, and you sell them in Jonesboro and Memphis and anybody down there that's needing lumber. This is how every single city in America and the world has been built for who knows how long. I mean, this is a very old technology. Here you can see the flywheel that powered everything. But all ancient cities are on rivers. All of the original cities in America are on rivers. It's because the rivers were the highways of the day. And it doesn't matter what you're building with. In this case, you mill the wood and you send it downstream to the city or wherever you're building. For a limestone building, you find a limestone quarry close to the river upstream. You have people up there rough cutting all the blocks and you send them down the river. Now, this is really steep terrain around here, so you've only got a half mile or so each side of the river as a viable option for commercial logging. They're not going to drag the logs over 5 hillsides to get it to the river. So by the 1920s, they had logged out all of the accessible lands that were near the current river. Once all the wood was gone, just like any other bust town out in the West, from a gold rush, all the jobs left, all the money left. A lot of people left and went to Oregon to work in the timber trade out there that's still going to this day. The people that decided to stay behind were probably the family members of the original settlers that just wanted to get away from everybody and had this place to themselves. This is a very territorial place that still to this day they don't really like outsiders coming in. Back in the 60s and 70s, they brought in a lot of new tourism with floating the rivers and everything, and the locals hated it. And you can't really blame them, because it was 1 or 2 guys renting all the canoes making all the money off the tourism. And these are people that had already seen a big logging boom and all this new money and all this, I'm sure, excitement and everything coming into town, and then packing up and going in a matter of years. After that, the only way you could make any money was hacking ties, as they called it. This was a documentary filmed back in the 70s or 80s. He's still got his old broadaxe from back when he used to hack ties, cut railroad ties for the railroad by hand. Paid a dime a piece to hack them babies out. And just for the record, factories and the railroad are what killed America, and I will cover that when I get into Reconstruction and talking about the South and the Northern occupation and re-education camps. All the stuff everybody fears today, it's already happened in this country. When the free people of America lost the War of Secession. Anyway, so that's the commercial side of things in this area. But also, people wanted to get away and just have their proverbial 40 acres and a mule. So these guys came out and just built their own community here. This is now called Falling Springs. But here in a second, you'll see the spring of ice cold cave water just continuously coming out of the wall. And these guys just took advantage of a natural situation that was just right for their purposes. The steel
just run you a sluice over from there and get your wheel going.
Made out of wood. They just went out in the forest and they built all this, made themselves a homestead that any homesteader today would be very jealous of. But keep in mind that mills were
cold,
not only
fresh
used
drinking
for
water
sawing
all the
wood, they were
time,
also
straight
used
out of
for
a
grinding
cave.
wheat, grinding corn, making flour, making cornbread. And I'll leave a link to this documentary down in the description box. But here's some old timers that are still making sorghum molasses the way they did back in the old days. He's actually got a mule on there walking around, twisting that log up top, and they're pressing all the sorghum, and it squeezes out into these vats that they slow cook down into molasses. And he said that back in the day, this was a huge yearly social event. You know, everybody had their sorghum patch. They'd get together and they'd make the year's supply of molasses. He said that each family would make, 100 pounds or so of molasses. Their main staples for food was cornbread, molasses, and butter. That was it. You had your milk cow and milk. Pretty sure everybody would have had chickens too, but he straight up said cornbread, molasses, and butter. The first bridge wasn't made over the Mississippi until the Eads Bridge opened in 1874. And before that, it was ferries. So they say that they crossed the Mississippi River at what was called Green's Old Ferry, and we crossed the Ohio River at what was called Golconda in an old horse boat. In that company, we were 17 persons. They were the Brown family and my wife's and my mother's two sisters named Fowler and the Reeser family. On reaching Missouri, the eldest brother, James M., shook hands with each of his brothers and sisters, bade them farewell, and departed northward, settling in the St. Joseph area. The rest of the company continued to Oregon County. Back in that time, when you were saying goodbye like that, that was it. That was goodbye. I'll probably never see you again. I don't think many people today have the courage to do that. But like I've said many times before, if you want to know how long people have been in an area, go to the graveyards. They've got their own family graveyard out here with, there's about 30 plots or so. The oldest one's dating back to about, 1882, and died at the ripe old age of 37. There wasn't the medicines that we have today, and it was pretty rough living back in these hills in that time. This was another small community mill known as Klepsig Mill, a few miles away from the main river. And this is a piece of engineering beauty here. This was a German engineer coming over. And guys, in the 1800s, they say that in Germany there was about 19,000 windmills alone. So this guy was just taking his old country knowledge from Germany, bringing it over here to America, set this masterpiece up.
So you got gate number one right there,
put a gate in
and
up
the
there.
chute is missing
the
through
concrete
here.
chute that he had poured is missing for about 40
to gate
yards
number
there.
Two.
He had another gate
Raise that up
right here.
Let the
that
water
you could
in.
control the water flow
And
into
boom.
the chute that leads to
Right
the
down
mill.
to your
This one was
generator.
built in 1914, a little later than the others, so this one had a little extra to it. This one, after the water came down, went down this chute, actually powered a Leffel turbine. I think Alley Springs had one too, but the Leffel turbine goes down in the bottom of the pit there. They still have the original shaft coming up, and they have the flywheel up in the main house. And though they did have electricity set up at this particular mill, the purpose of the Leffel turbine is to just increase the power, get the maximum efficiency out of your water flow coming, through your chute. And I just got to show you guys the foundation on this. Now, this may look like just some hack backwoods slap and go stuff, but keep in mind, this is over 100 years old. This is an old technique of wall building just known as dry stacking, where you literally just chink in all the rocks to where you get a good tight fit. I have literally jacked up and fixed 2 foundations here in the area, but this is still standing. And look at that. It's like a 90-degree angle of repose. That is just beautiful. The guy knew what he was doing there. So that was what was going on in 1914. Just for reference, the Thomas Brown cabin, the one with the water wheel, was settled 70 years earlier in 1851. So this is what some people were doing while others were flocking off to California for the gold rush. And the original 17 people that settled in that area around the mill went on to build a schoolhouse in the early 1900s for all the school kids in the area. So I just wanted to show everybody what people were actually doing out in the middle of nowhere 150 years ago. And if you can't figure out how people built cities, then maybe you should get out of the city, go out into the country, go to a Civil War battlefield, go to all of these historical sites that we have all across the country that people's grandparents still live right there in the area and know exactly what their grandparents were doing back in that time frame. And all I can say is if Westerners didn't come over and steal this land from the Cherokee, then the controllers are really trying to sell this lie, because they spent countless hours cutting arrowheads and planting them all over these hillsides. I happen to think that we have a very interesting history of this country, and that the Constitution was a one-of-a-kind revolutionary idea. Unfortunately, America only operated under it for about 70 years. But I'll get to that on my video about Southern Reconstruction and the conquest, the real conquest of America, and how America was really built. Or I'll just go swimming. I like swimming too. Static out.